The Dakota winter of 1879 gnawed through the Miller sisters' shack like a hungry wolf. Inside, 13-year-old Elizabeth clutched a battered tin box to her chest, its surface marked with rust-colored fingerprints, her mother's blood, from when consumption claimed her 2 winters past. The box held their last hope, a handful of coins Margaret Miller had hidden before death took her. "They're coming." Catherine whispered, her 12-year-old frame trembling not from fear, but from the merciless cold that had settled in their bones. Her eyes, practical beyond her years, darted to the window. 10-year-old Rebecca pressed against Elizabeth, her precious drawing pad clutched to her thin chest, fingers blackened with charcoal. Outside, torchlight cut through darkness. Elizabeth pushed her sisters toward the corner, fingers wrapping around their mother's kitchen knife, the one possession their father hadn't yet traded for whiskey. The door crashed open before any knock could fall. 3 silhouettes filled the doorway, clinking ominously, chains swinging from a burly man's fist. Rebecca's scream tore through the night as the largest man stepped into the faint candlelight, his face a map of calculated cruelty. "The Miller's treasures," he said, eyes appraising them like livestock. "Exactly as promised." Elizabeth lunged forward, knife catching the dim light. A massive hand seized her wrist, twisting until bone creaked and the blade clattered to the floor. "Feisty." The man laughed, his breath foul with whiskey. "Crawford breaks spirit like that personally." Behind them, uneven footsteps approached. Their father, once a respected Boston accountant, now a hollow-eyed stranger, staggered into the cabin, a bottle dangling from his trembling fingers. "Papa?" Rebecca's voice held a child's final plea. Harold Miller wouldn't meet their eyes. "Had to be done," he muttered. Crawford offered positions, better than starving. Elizabeth's nails bit into her palms. "You sold us." The taller, well-dressed man, Parker, smiled thinly, waving contracts in hand. "After seeing the merchandise, I'd say we've done you a favor." His gaze lingered on Rebecca. "Especially this one. You'll fetch a high price in certain establishments, won't you, darling?" Elizabeth launched herself at him. "We're not yours." The backhand from Crawford sent her sprawling blood blooming at the corner of her mouth. The message was clear: they were no longer persons, but property. "Chain them," Crawford ordered. "Dawn comes early." Catherine helped Elizabeth to her feet, their eyes meeting in silent communication. They had seconds, not minutes. "Now," Elizabeth hissed. Catherine kicked burning embers toward the men. Rebecca darted between legs. Elizabeth shoved past the momentarily distracted henchmen, grabbing Catherine's hand as they bolted into the frozen night. A pistol cracked. Snow exploded near Elizabeth's feet as they ran 3 small figures against the vast, unforgiving darkness, their father's betrayal burning colder than the winter air itself. The sisters collapsed among snow-laden pines, lungs burning. Through the trees, torchlight multiplied. Crawford's men were tracking them. "The widow Jenkins has that cabin 3 miles north." Catherine suggested, her practical mind already working despite their desperate situation. "But Papa sold us Lizzie," Rebecca whispered, voice brittle with disbelief. "For whiskey." Elizabeth pulled her sisters close, unable to soften this cruelest of truths. "We have each other. That's all that matters now." A branch snapped nearby. The forest went silent. Elizabeth reached for a fallen branch as torchlight splintered the darkness. "If I can't have what's mine..." Crawford's voice boomed closer than expected. "Then perhaps I'll just burn this forest down around your ears." A torch arced through the darkness, landing yards away. Pine needles caught instantly, flames licking upward despite the snow, the smell of coal oil confirming Crawford's deadly intentions. "Time's up, girls," Crawford called, twisted glee in his voice. Elizabeth pulled her sisters to their feet. "Run. Don't look back." They plunged deeper into the forest flames, climbing trees behind them. Rebecca stumbled repeatedly, her small body beyond exhaustion. Elizabeth hoisted her onto her back, refusing to slow despite her depleting strength. At a frozen stream, Catherine stopped abruptly. Listen, hoofbeats approached not from behind, but ahead. 5 riders materialized through smoke-hazed moonlight, their silhouettes unmistakable native warriors on horseback. Elizabeth made a desperate choice. Crawford's fire advanced. His men were close behind. The winter night would kill them within hours. She stepped into the open. "Help us," she called across the frozen stream. "Please." The leader dismounted, approaching with cautious grace. He was younger than Elizabeth expected, perhaps 20, with alert eyes that assessed them without malice. "You bring fire to our lands," he said, English accented but clear. "And men with guns follow." "And not by choice," Elizabeth answered, chin raised despite her terror. "We're running from Silverton Crawford. He means to enslave us in his mines." The young man's expression darkened at the name. One of the mounted warriors spoke sharply in Lakota, gesturing toward the approaching flames. The leader nodded, then turned back to Elizabeth. "I am Thomas Thunder Eagle. We have no love for Crawford." He studied them briefly, something flickering in his eyes. Recognition of their desperation, perhaps, or memory of his own. "Come with us now, or die here. Choose quickly." Catherine stepped forward. "Why would you help us?" "Because Crawford's evil touches all," Thomas replied. "And winter shows no mercy to children, regardless of their skin." Rebecca's violent coughing made the decision inevitable. Thomas gestured, and one of his companions dismounted, lifting the small girl onto his horse. "She rides with Sleeping Bear," Thomas said. "You two share Swift Elk's horse. We must move quickly." Elizabeth hesitated only briefly. "They'll follow our tracks." Thomas's smile was grim. "Let them try. The fire will reach Crawford's men before they reach us." They rode hard through the night, the Lakota warriors navigating treacherous terrain with practiced skill. Dawn broke cold and clear as Thomas finally called a halt in a sheltered ravine. Thomas approached with a small pouch. "My mother's remedy for cold sickness." While Catherine tended to Rebecca, Elizabeth asked the question foremost in her mind. "Why does Crawford want us so badly? There are other poor families he could exploit." Thomas studied her intently. "Crawford believes someone has stolen something valuable from him." "We took nothing," Elizabeth protested. Thomas's eyes narrowed, measuring her reaction carefully. He glanced at Sleeping Bear, who stood nearby, hands lingering near his knife, in a way that suddenly seemed less protective and more threatening. "2 winters ago," Thomas said slowly, "Crawford's men came to our sacred lands. My grandfather refused them entry." His voice hardened. "They beat him until his bones broke, then staked mining claims over our ancestors' graves." A distant rifle shot echoed across the hills. Swift Elk, who had been scouting, returned at a gallop. "Riders," he reported tersely. "A dozen. Crawford's men and your father." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. "He's helping them track us. No, but for whiskey and forgiveness of debts," Thomas said grimly. "A man like that would track his own children to their graves." They rode hard through the day, Thomas leading them to a trapper's cabin by twilight. Inside, Rebecca fell asleep instantly after eating. Elizabeth fought exhaustion longer, watching Thomas and his men confer in low voices. Thomas moved to sit beside her. "Sleep," he urged. "Tomorrow brings its own battles. Why are you really helping us?" Elizabeth asked, suspicion mingling with gratitude. Thomas was quiet for a moment, staring into the small fire. "You remind me of my sisters," he finally said. "They died during the winter of great hunger, when the government agents stole our food. I was away hunting. When I returned..." He stopped, pain etching deeper lines around his eyes. "I could not save them. Perhaps the spirits offer me another chance through you." His sincerity seemed genuine. Yet Elizabeth noticed how Sleeping Bear watched him during this confession, and the older warrior's expression unreadable, but somehow charged with tension. There was more to this story than Thomas was sharing. Dawn brought urgent whispers. "Crawford's men found our trail," Thomas explained. "They approach from the south, 8 riders, including your father. How long do we have? An hour, perhaps less." Thomas's jaw tightened. "And 2 more groups approach from east and west. Crawford has surrounded us." "Why?" Elizabeth demanded. "Why use so many men to track 3 girls?" Thomas studied her intently. "When your father sold you, did he give you anything to bring to Crawford?" Elizabeth started to shake her head, then froze as memory surfaced. "The pack. Papa gave us a pack the morning before they came. Said it was Mother's things." Swift Elk retrieved the small leather pack. Thomas's hands moved with surprising gentleness as he examined it, fingers finding a hidden seam. Using his knife, he opened the concealment. From within, he extracted several folded papers. As he unfolded them, his expression transformed from curiosity to shock quickly masked. "Land treaties," he said, voice hushed. "Original treaties between the U.S. government and the Lakota nation showing the true boundaries of our lands." His fingers traced the attached map. "This proves Crawford's mines are on Lakota territory land he has no legal right to develop." Rebecca pointed to notations in the margin. "Papa's handwriting." Thomas examined them. "Grave sites. Your father was marking Lakota burial grounds precisely where Crawford's richest mines operate." But his eyes lingered on markings in the corner of the map, symbols that meant nothing to Elizabeth, but clearly disturbed him greatly. "He's not just after us," Elizabeth realized. "He's eliminating everyone who knows the truth. The foreman who fell down a mine shaft last month. Crawford killed him," Thomas finished, "and now hunts you for the same reason." A rifle shot cracked the morning stillness, splintering the cabin's window. "They're here," Swift Elk said, crawling to the window to return fire. Thomas split their group, taking the sisters and the documents north toward Bismarck, while the others created a diversion. They plunged into the snowy dawn, but were spotted halfway to the trees. A bullet struck Thomas's horse in the flank. The animal reared in pain, throwing both Thomas and Elizabeth into the snow. Catherine managed to control her horse, keeping Rebecca secure, but they were effectively stranded. "Go!" Thomas shouted to Catherine. "Take Rebecca and ride north, stay on the game trails." Elizabeth scrambled to Thomas's side, retrieving his fallen pistol. They made a desperate stand behind a fallen log, while Catherine and Rebecca escaped. Elizabeth emptied the pistol at an approaching rider. Her final shot struck home, and the man fell. Thomas wasn't as fortunate. A bullet caught him in the side, dropping him to his knees. Elizabeth scrambled to his side as he pressed a hand against the spreading bloodstain. Before Elizabeth could argue, hoofbeats announced her father's approach. Harold Miller rode forward slowly, rifle held ready, but not aimed. "Elizabeth," he called, voice trembling. "It's over. Come with me now and Crawford will show mercy." "Mercy," Elizabeth spat. Like he showed Thomas's grandfather, Harold flinched. "You don't understand what you're caught up in." "I understand perfectly," Elizabeth replied. "You stole sacred documents proving Crawford's crimes, then sold us to cover your tracks." Harold's expression crumpled. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Crawford discovered I had taken the treaties, threatened to kill you all. I thought if I gave them to you hidden, then delivered you to him, he would be satisfied once he searched you and found nothing. While innocent people died and had their land stolen," Elizabeth countered. "I was trying to protect you the only way I knew how. By selling us." Elizabeth's voice broke. "By betraying everything Mother taught us about honor." The moment stretched between them, years of disappointment crystallizing into this confrontation. "Give me the documents, Elizabeth," Harold pleaded. "Crawford will call off the hunt." "No, Father. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them all turn. To Elizabeth's astonishment, Catherine appeared with Rebecca, but they weren't alone. Behind them rode a dozen Lakota warriors, including Sleeping Bear and Swift Elk. Harold's face drained of color. Elizabeth lunged forward, wresting his rifle from his hands. "It's over, Father," she said, the rifle now trained on him. The Lakota warriors surrounded them, some dismounting to tend to Thomas, while others secured Harold. Catherine explained how they had found the warriors on the trail they had doubled back after leading Crawford's men away. Thomas was being helped onto a horse, his wound bandaged, but serious. "The documents," he said weakly. "Are they safe?" Elizabeth nodded, drawing them from inside her coat. "Safe. And so are we, thanks to you." Their journey took them to the Lakota camp, before continuing to Eagle Ford, where they joined white traders heading to Bismarck. Harold led Crawford's men away, arriving later with wounds that spoke of a narrow escape. Bismarck appeared as a smudge of smoke on the horizon, wooden buildings flanking muddy streets, the territorial capital's dome rising at the center. At the Capitol building, Walter Pemberton received them in his office, a tall man with spectacles and graying sideburns who claimed to have known their mother. "I knew your mother," he said. Margaret was remarkable. Her passing changed Harold profoundly. As Pemberton spoke, his eyes darted briefly to the window, and then to the clock on his wall. His fingers drummed once on his desk before stilling unnaturally. Elizabeth caught these subtle signs of nervousness, filing them away. Elizabeth presented the documents. "These are original land treaties showing the true boundaries of Lakota territory, boundaries that Crawford has deliberately falsified." As Pemberton examined the papers, his hand trembled slightly. "These appear authentic," he said, voice carefully controlled. "But if so, they prove more than simple fraud. They show Crawford's most productive minds are operating illegally on Lakota land." "Crawford has murdered to keep this secret," Catherine added. Pemberton's assistant interrupted with news that Crawford had arrived in Bismarck with armed men, offering rewards for information about the sisters. "Crawford moves faster than anticipated," Pemberton observed, seeming unsurprised. He suggested they take refuge at the newspaper office with James Wainwright of the Dakota Territorial Dispatch. As they gathered their belongings, Rebecca tugged Elizabeth's sleeve. "I don't trust him, Lizzie," she whispered. "He looked at the papers funny, and he keeps checking the window like he's waiting for someone." Elizabeth had noticed it too, the subtle hesitations, the careful control, the lack of genuine surprise at Crawford's rapid arrival. But they had few options and fewer allies. Wainwright welcomed them cautiously at the newspaper office. "Crawford's missing girls, I presume?" he asked. "Half the town's talking about the reward." "We're not runaways," Elizabeth stated firmly. "And we have proof of Crawford's crimes documents he would kill to recover." Wainwright examined the treaties with a magnifying glass. "Genuine," he confirmed. "These documents are the keystone I've been missing." He indicated a locked cabinet. In there are testimonies from miners who've witnessed brutality, accounts of claim jumping, even evidence of bribery. That night, Harold arrived at the newspaper office, bringing Crawford's account ledger stolen during their confrontation. It details payments to officials, judges, marshals, everyone he's bribed. Harold explained. Wainwright's eyes widened as he examined the ledger. "This isn't just about land theft. It's about a network reaching to Washington." "Washington?" Elizabeth asked, stunned. "These entries, coded but clear enough, show payments to senators, federal judges, even a cabinet secretary." He tapped a particular page. "Crawford isn't the head of this snake. He's merely a well-paid agent for Eastern interests seeking to control legislation through territorial influence." How could mining silver on Lakota land be worth that level of corruption? Catherine wondered. "It's not just silver," Harold said quietly. "The real value is in what lies beneath specific minerals, essential for the new electrical industries. Edison, Westinghouse, Bell. They're all desperate for these materials. Whoever controls the supplies controls the future. Wainwright noticed something else in the documents. Faint markings on the treaty maps that had been nearly erased. "These markings," he muttered. "They indicate deposits of something the government document calls Element X. Crawford's mines aren't just desecrating graves. They're extracting a material that could change warfare itself. No wonder Washington's involved." Dawn brought bitter cold and fresh snow. The front page of the dispatch was set in type and ready for printing when Crawford's men surrounded the newspaper office. "They're coming here," Harold warned. "Right now." Wainwright cursed under his breath, then composed himself. "I knew this was coming. Harold, take the girls to the cellar. There's a hidden room behind the wine rack. Go now." The sisters hurried down to the cellar. Harold found the concealed door, revealing a small room. "Stay here," he instructed. "No matter what you hear, stay silent." "You're not staying with us?" Catherine asked, surprised. Harold shook his head. "Wainwright needs help. I've run from enough fights in my life." Through cracks in the hidden door, Elizabeth watched as Harold confronted Crawford in the cellar, drawing attention away from their hiding place. When Crawford discovered the printing plates for the next day's explosive headline, his rage turned murderous. "The treaties aren't here, Crawford," Harold called out, creating a desperate diversion. Thomas Thunder Eagle took them to the Lakota camp. By now, 20 warriors are riding to Fort Abraham Lincoln with copies. Crawford seized Harold by the throat. "You're lying," he snarled. "Tell me the truth or I'll kill you where you stand." Harold's eyes met Elizabeth through the crack in the door. "Kill me, then," he wheezed. "Won't change the fact that your empire is crumbling?" The knife plunged forward. Harold's body jerked. Crimson bloomed across his shirt. Elizabeth bit down on her hand to keep from crying out, tears streaming down her face as her father slumped to the floor. Smoke began drifting down the cellar stairs. Wainwright had set fire to his own press as a diversion. The sisters escaped through a small window, emerging into the snow-covered alley behind the newspaper office. Rebecca suddenly cried out, "The documents, Lizzie, the treaties!" Elizabeth's hand went to her coat empty. In the chaos of escape, she'd left the precious papers in their hiding place. Without them, Crawford would rebuild his power, the truth buried forever. "I have to go back," she said, turning toward the window. Catherine grabbed her arm. "You can't look." The rear wall of the building was engulfed in flames. There would be no return, no retrieval of the vital evidence. Papa's account book. Elizabeth realized with horror. Wainwright's evidence. It's all burning. Crawford's men circled the building, maintaining a perimeter. The sisters were trapped in the alley with flames at their back and enemies ahead. "Up," Catherine whispered, pointing to a ladder that led to the roof of the adjacent building. From the rooftop, they watched the dispatch burn entirely. Crawford himself directing his men below his face, illuminated by the inferno. "Where do we go now?" Rebecca asked, her voice small and frightened. "The documents are gone. Papa's gone." "Not everything," came a voice behind them. Thomas Thunder Eagle crouched on the rooftop, his wound clearly paining him, but determination burning in his eyes. "Thomas," Elizabeth gasped. "How did you find us?" "The fire. We saw the smoke from our position outside town," Thomas explained. "What happened to the documents?" Elizabeth's face fell. "They were in the cellar. The fire," Thomas smiled grimly. "I thought as much. That's why I brought these." From inside his coat, he extracted several folded papers, Rebecca's detailed copies of the treaties made during their stay in the Lakota camp. "Rebecca's drawings," Catherine exclaimed. "Your sister has a remarkable gift," Thomas said. "Her copies include every detail, the signatures, the seals, even the secret markings about Element X." The elders confirmed their accuracy. Hope surged in Elizabeth's chest, quickly tempered by reality. "But Crawford's burned Wainwright's press. How do we get the truth out now?" "The governor's house is northeast of town." Sleeping Bear said, appearing silently behind Thomas. 3 miles. We have horses hidden in the woods. The direct approach, Thomas added. Crawford expects deception and hiding, not a bold move toward his most powerful enemy. The journey across the rooftops was perilous. Icy shingles, dangerous gaps between buildings, the constant fear of discovery. Rebecca struggled to keep up her small frame, battered by wind and exhaustion. Sleeping Bear finally carried her on his back, moving with surprising grace despite the burden. They reached the edge of town as darkness fell, the glow of the fire still visible behind them. As they mounted the waiting horses, a shout rose from the edge of town. Crawford! And several men on horseback, torches held high, scanning the tree line. "I'll go," Thomas urged. "We'll lead them away." Elizabeth didn't waste time arguing. She urged their horse forward while Thomas and Sleeping Bear rode in the opposite direction, deliberately making noise to draw Crawford's pursuit. Snow began falling heavily, a blessing if they could reach the governor's estate before Crawford realized he'd been deceived. After what felt like hours, lights appeared ahead, a substantial house set back from the road, surrounded by a fence and outbuildings. "State your business," challenged the guard at the gate. "We need to see the governor," Elizabeth said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "It's about Silverton Crawford and the Lakota land treaties." The minutes stretched interminably as they waited for the guard's return. Finally, he led them up a well-kept path to the main house, where warmth enveloped them like a physical presence. Governor Burbank was younger than Elizabeth had expected, with intelligent eyes that assessed them carefully. Beside him stood Walter Pemberton, whose presence initially relieved Elizabeth until she noticed the tension in his posture. "These are the Miller girls?" Burbank asked Pemberton, who nodded confirmation. "Thank you for seeing us, sir," Elizabeth began, but Burbank raised a hand to stop her. "Walter has briefed me on your situation," the governor said. "You claim to have documents proving Crawford's mines operate illegally on Lakota land." Rebecca reluctantly withdrew the carefully folded papers from inside her dress. She handed them to Elizabeth, who presented them to the governor with steady hands. Burbank examined the documents while Pemberton stood oddly still, his eyes fixed on the papers rather than on the governor. After what seemed an eternity, Burbank looked up. "These appear authentic," he concluded. "The seals, the signatures, all consistent with territorial records." "The official records have been altered," Catherine pointed out. "That's how Crawford has gotten away with this for so long." The governor studied them thoughtfully. "Your father, Harold Miller. Where is he now?" Elizabeth's throat tightened. "Dead, sir. Killed by Crawford while trying to protect us." Burbank's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry for your loss." He turned to Pemberton. "Walter, your thoughts on these documents?" All three sisters watched Pemberton, whose face had gone pale. He cleared his throat. "They appear genuine, Governor. However, interrupted a voice from the doorway. "They are clever forgeries created to damage the reputation of the territory's most valuable citizen." Crawford himself stood in the study doorway, snow still melting on his expensive coat, 2 armed men flanking him. The guard from the gate looked apologetic. "I'm sorry, sir," he said to the governor. "Mr. Crawford insisted it was urgent territorial business." Elizabeth felt her blood run cold, not just at Crawford's appearance, but at the lack of surprise on Pemberton's face. Suddenly, his earlier hesitations made terrible sense. "You," she breathed, staring at Pemberton. "You work for him." Pemberton couldn't meet her eyes. "It's more complicated than that, Elizabeth." Crawford smiled thinly. "Mr. Pemberton understands that progress requires pragmatism. The silver from my mines has built this territory." He stepped further into the room, including certain officials' salaries and supplemental income. Governor Burbank rose, his face flushing. "That's enough, Crawford. Whatever your insinuations, I've never taken a bribe in my life. Perhaps not directly. Crawford agreed smoothly. But you've certainly benefited from the prosperity my operations bring. Would you risk that prosperity over some questionable documents and the word of 3 vagrant children? Elizabeth watched in horror as Crawford's men moved to block the exits. Pemberton edged toward the documents on the desk. With a surge of clarity, she realized his intent to seize and destroy the evidence before it could be examined further. No, she cried, lunging forward to snatch the treaties, but Crawford's man caught her arm, twisting it painfully behind her back. Pemberton grabbed the papers, but surprisingly, instead of handing them to Crawford, he backed away, his expression unreadable. "I've waited too long for this moment, Crawford," he said quietly. Crawford's face registered confusion. "What are you playing at, Walter? Give me those papers now." "I don't think I will," Pemberton replied, a new steel in his voice. He moved behind the governor's desk, placing himself between Crawford and the large windows. "You see, some of us have longer memories than you might expect." Walter, the governor, questioned clearly, as confused as everyone else in the room. "My real name," Pemberton said, eyes never leaving Crawford, "is Walter Blackfeather. My mother was Lakota's sister to Black Bear, Thomas Thunder Eagle's grandfather." Crawford's face went ashen. "That's impossible. Your background was thoroughly investigated when you placed me in the governor's office as your spy." Pemberton finished. "Yes, very thorough. Except my mother was sent east as a child, raised by missionaries who gave her a white name and a white education. I've spent 15 years working my way into a position where I could finally access proof of what happened to our lands." Rebecca gasped. "That's why you sent us to Wainwright. You knew Crawford would follow us there away from here. I needed time to contact certain people." Pemberton confirmed. With perfect timing, the study doors opened again. 2 well-dressed men entered, flanked by federal marshals who immediately trained their weapons on Crawford's men. "For Calvastes Silverton Crawford," the taller man announced formally. "I'm Special Agent Wilson of the United States Department of Justice. You're under arrest for bribery of federal officials, land fraud, and conspiracy against the United States government." Crawford's composure finally cracked. "This is absurd, Governor. I demand you put a stop to this immediately." "I'm afraid the governor's authority doesn't supersede federal jurisdiction," Agent Wilson replied calmly. "Especially when the governor himself is a witness to your attempted intimidation and bribery." Crawford made a desperate lunge toward Rebecca, the smallest and most vulnerable target. But Catherine intercepted him, driving her knee upward with surprising strength. As Crawford doubled over in pain, Sleeping Bear materialized from the shadows of the room where he'd been hidden, pressing a knife to Crawford's throat. 15 years I've waited to do this," the Lakota warrior growled. "Give me one reason not to." "Sleeping Bear, no," Thomas called from the doorway, where he now stood with a half-dozen more Lakota warriors. "He must face white man's justice. That was our agreement." Crawford was efficiently restrained, but his eyes burned with malevolent promise. "You think this is over?" he hissed at Elizabeth. "I have men who will carry out my orders, even if I'm in chains. None of you will live to see morning." As if summoned by his threat, gunfire erupted outside the governor's residence. Agent Wilson rushed to the window. "Crawford's reinforcements," he reported grimly. "At least 20 armed men attempting to breach the gates." "The copies," Elizabeth cried suddenly, realizing Rebecca's drawn copies of the treaties were still clutched in Pemberton's hand. "If Crawford's men break in, they won't get them," Pemberton assured her, sliding the papers into a metal tube which he sealed and handed to Thomas. "Take these to the North Ridge, where our people wait. If we fall here, at least the truth will survive." Thomas hesitated, torn between his duty to the documents and his desire to protect the sisters. "Go," Elizabeth urged. We'll be safe with the federal agents. As Thomas disappeared through a side door, the gunfire intensified. The governor's home was under siege. The house won't hold for long, Agent Wilson assessed grimly. Too many windows, too few defenders. There's a root cellar, Governor Burbank suggested. Stone walls, single entrance. We could defend it more effectively. As they hurried toward this potential sanctuary, a massive explosion rocked the building. Crawford's men had dynamite. The floor beneath them buckled, and Rebecca stumbled, sliding toward a collapsing section of floor. Elizabeth dove for her sister, catching her hand just as the floor gave way. Rebecca dangled over a 10-foot drop to the burning room below her small face, white with terror, the precious document tube she'd secretly taken from Thomas clutched in her free hand. "Don't let go," Elizabeth cried, straining to pull her sister up as the flames rose higher. Catherine grabbed Elizabeth's legs, anchoring her, while Sleeping Bear reached down to seize Rebecca's arm with his powerful grip. Together, they hauled the youngest sister to safety just as the remainder of the floor collapsed. "This way," Burbank shouted above the roar of flames, leading them down a narrow servant staircase to the kitchens. They reached the root cellar just as Crawford's men breached the main entrance. Agent Wilson and his marshals positioned themselves to defend the single narrow doorway, while Sleeping Bear used his knife to create a small escape tunnel through the earthen back wall, a desperate last resort if the cellar was overrun. Rebecca, still shaking from her near-fatal fall, pulled the document tube from inside her dress. "I took it from Thomas," she confessed. "I thought it would be safer with us." Gunfire erupted outside the cellar door. The marshals returned fire, but they were clearly outnumbered. Smoke began seeping under the door. Crawford's men were trying to smoke them out. "The tunnel's ready," Sleeping Bear announced. "But it's small, only the children can fit through." Elizabeth looked at the tube in Rebecca's hands. "The evidence has to get out, even if we don't," she said grimly. "I'll take it." Rebecca volunteered, her young face set with determination that belied her years. "No," Catherine countered. "You're still weak from the smoke. I should go." Agent Wilson interrupted their debate. "None of you should go alone. There could be men watching the grounds. We need a diversion." A voice called from outside the cellar door, one of Crawford's lieutenants. "You've got 5 minutes to surrender the documents and the girls. After that, we burn the whole place down with you in it." Pemberton or Blackfeather, as he had revealed himself to be, made a swift decision. "I'll create your diversion," he said, checking his revolver. "When you hear me fire from the east side of the house, take the girls through the tunnel and run west toward the tree line. My people are waiting there." "That's suicide," Governor Burbank protested. Pemberton smiled sadly. "I've lived too long as someone else, Governor. Time to die as myself." Before anyone could stop him, he slipped out through the cellar door, firing rapidly to clear a path. The sounds of pursuit followed him immediately, exactly as he'd intended. "It's now," Agent Wilson commanded. "Go while they're distracted." Elizabeth hesitated. "But Crawford is secure," Wilson assured her, indicating where the mining baron sat handcuffed to a support beam guarded by a marshal. "He'll answer for his crimes." The sisters crawled through the narrow earth tunnel, emerging behind a snow-covered hedge some distance from the burning governor's mansion. As instructed, they ran west, keeping low, the document tube secure in Catherine's hand. They had nearly reached the tree line when a shot rang out. Catherine cried out, stumbling forward. A bullet had grazed her shoulder, blood quickly staining her dress. Behind them, a lone figure on horseback emerged from the shadows. Crawford's most trusted assassin, known throughout the territory as the Butcher. "Now hand over the papers," he called calmly, raising his rifle again. "Or the next one goes through her heart." Elizabeth stepped in front of her wounded sister. "If you want them, come and take them," she challenged, hoping to buy time, though she had no plan beyond that moment. The Butcher dismounted, approaching with predatory confidence. He was within 10 feet of them when an arrow struck him in the chest with such force it knocked him backward into the snow. More arrows followed, and Lakota warriors seemed to materialize from the trees themselves. Thomas rode forward, bow still in hand. "You took a wrong turn," he told the butcher as the man gasped his last breaths. "This is Lakota land now." The sisters were quickly surrounded by protective warriors and led to horses. As they rode away from the governor's burning mansion, Elizabeth looked back to see federal reinforcements arriving too late for the building, but in time to secure the surviving conspirators. "Pemberton?" she asked Thomas, fearing the answer. "Died as he wished," Thomas replied solemnly, "as a warrior of our people." 3 weeks later, Elizabeth stood in the territorial courtroom watching as Crawford was brought in for sentencing. The trial had been swift, the evidence overwhelming not just the treaties and account books, but testimony from nearly a dozen officials who had turned against Crawford to save themselves. Agent Wilson had explained the full scope of the conspiracy. Crawford's mines weren't just extracting silver, but a rare mineral critical to new electrical weapons being developed by the War Department. The Eastern industrialists backing him had connections reaching into the cabinet itself, men who had authorized any means necessary to secure the mineral supply, including the theft of Lakota land and the desecration of sacred burial grounds, all to power machines of war. Thomas had said bitterly when he learned the truth. Crawford was sentenced to life imprisonment at a federal penitentiary. His assets were seized, his mines closed, the Lakota lands restored under new treaties witnessed by federal authorities, who for once seemed genuinely committed to honoring their provisions. As Crawford was led away, his eyes met Elizabeth's briefly. She expected hatred, threats, perhaps even fear. Instead, she saw something more disturbing: certainty. As if, even in defeat, he knew something she didn't. That evening, as the sisters prepared for bed in their temporary quarters at the territorial capital, Rebecca asked the question that had haunted Elizabeth since the courtroom. "Is it really over, Lizzie?" she whispered. Crawford looked so sure of himself. Elizabeth hugged her youngest sister close. "Men like Crawford always believe they'll win in the end. It's what makes them dangerous and blind." But later that night, after her sisters were asleep, Elizabeth crept downstairs to where Thomas and Governor Burbank were speaking in hushed tones. "Still unaccounted for," Thomas was saying. "At least 5 crates of the mineral were shipped east before the mines were closed. The federal agents are tracking them," Burbank assured him. "But you're right to be concerned. The weapons they could power are why this isn't over." Elizabeth interrupted, making both men turn in surprise. Burbank sighed, gesturing for her to join them. "No, it's not entirely over. Crawford was part of something larger than himself. But for now, your part in this fight is complete. You and your sisters have earned peace." Thomas nodded agreement. The journey ahead belongs to others now. 3 months later, under a Dakota sky just beginning to hint at spring, Elizabeth stood on the porch of the newly renamed Thunder Eagle and Miller Trading Post. Inside, Catherine had organized medicinal supplies that impressed both white customers and Lakota healers. Rebecca's artwork scenes of Lakota life, drawn with remarkable skill, attracted attention from visitors far and wide. Thomas joined Elizabeth as the day's business concluded. "A good beginning," he observed. "Better than I hoped." Elizabeth nodded, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Just a beginning, though. Crawford may be in prison, but the forces he served are still out there, still hungry for what lies beneath these lands." "True," Thomas agreed. "But your people have a saying about journeys and single steps." Elizabeth smiled at that. "My mother used to say that. She also used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite being afraid." Beyond the trading post, Silverton was changing too. The mines on legitimate claims continued operating under new management. Those on Lakota land were closed, the sacred burial grounds restored and protected by federal order. The investigation sparked by Crawford's downfall had expanded, reaching into Washington itself. Several congressmen had resigned rather than face exposure. A cabinet secretary had been indicted. The networks of corruption were being slowly dismantled, though Elizabeth harbored no illusions that the fight was truly over. Your stand against injustice, Governor Burbank had written in a recent letter, has created ripples that continue to spread. History may never record your names, but the changes you helped initiate will affect this territory, and perhaps this nation, for generations to come. Elizabeth read the letter aloud to her sisters as they sat on the trading post's roof on a warm evening, watching fireflies rise from the prairie grasses beyond town. "It feels strange," Catherine remarked when Elizabeth finished, "to think of ourselves as making history. We were just trying to survive. Maybe that's how history usually happens." Elizabeth mused. People doing what they must, not realizing how far the consequences will reach. Rebecca, who had been sketching the sunset, looked up from her work. "Do you think Papa knows about what happened? About us being here?" It was the kind of question that had no easy answer, the kind that reminded Elizabeth that for all their forced maturity, they were still children who had lost both parents too young. "I think he does," she said gently. "I think he and Mama both know. And I think they're proud of us for finding our way, even when the path wasn't clear." Thomas joined them, bringing news from the reservation, a child healed by Catherine's medicine plans for expanding trade progress on the school where Rebecca would study. As they talked into twilight, Elizabeth touched the small medicine pouch at her neck. Many Winter's protective totem, now containing a pinch of earth from their father's grave, mixed with sage and sweetgrass. Not to dwell in grief, but to remember that even the most broken among us can find redemption. The Dakota Territory remained a harsh land that forgave little and promised less. Justice was still imperfect, prejudice still common. Yet, in this small corner of it, something had shifted. 3 sisters who had been sold for whiskey had purchased their freedom with courage, determination, and unwavering commitment to truth. As night fell, completely stars emerging in brilliant clarity above the frontier town, Elizabeth joined her sisters and Thomas in planning tomorrow's work. Life continued moment by moment, choice by choice, building something stronger than the foundations of tragedy upon which they stood. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.